I won't spend too much time introducing each of our panelists in detail. You've heard about them already. Charles Owina from AERC, Norma Correa from CIES in Peru, Azra Cader from CEPA, and Nuning from Akhmadi from SMERU in Indonesia. There are others of this network, the Evidence-Based Policy and Development Network, scattered around the room. And of course, I'm sure you're all interested in the subject, so I hope you include yourselves in this dialogue. My name is Enrique Mendizabal. I work in the Overseas Development Institute, and I'm program leader of a program that tries to understand what is the relationship between research and policy. How does it happen? How does the research that is done in academia, or in think tanks, or in consultancies, or in the private sector feed into decisions that policymakers make? We're trying to suggest that it has to be done in a particular way, but we want to know how it happens. Based on that research, based on that understanding, we're trying to promote better practices, build or develop capacities to communicate research more effectively, to manage knowledge more effectively, to research more effectively, to think about whether we need to include a panel of policymakers in our boards or in our teams, or whether we need to engage with the general public, or whether we need to include in our research teams people with different perspectives. So it's an ongoing process about learning. And we find, of course, that context matters. As usual, we always say, well, it depends on the context. But by having a network that covers quite a few contexts, we want to get away from the usual escape route of saying, well, context matters. And hopefully we can say something about these different contexts. The objective of this particular dialogue then is to share some of the lessons or some of the practices that our ebpdn members have experienced. And we've also asked Charles to join us to provide an African perspective, to provide a Kenyan-based perspective, particularly because he's doing some of his work in AERC, based in Nairobi, communication of research. Okay? But I do hope that you will interrupt or raise your hand and let us know if you have any questions for the panelists, for myself, and for anybody. The way we've organized it is that I suggested a number of questions that I would ask the panelists, rather than have a long presentation from each. And I asked them to be brief, to give us the answer to some of these questions, and hopefully we'll have a dialogue among ourselves and Azra, can I start with you, since you are right at the corner. A question that encompasses the first two. What in Sri Lanka? What are the roles that research-based evidence play in the policy process? Different stages of the policy process.
Okay. If I answer that question, I think that research does play a role in policy in Sri Lanka, but it plays a role to a certain extent. And why I say this is because for a number of reasons. It really depends on who is making the policy and why the policy is being made. So it can be largely on political grounds, or it can be because there is a felt need for a certain policy to be made. It really depends on who is pushing a certain policy process forward. If it's political, then it may not necessarily be evidence-based. If it is pushed by the bureaucracy, there's a chance that it will be policy, the policies will be based on evidence. So usually policies can be made because there is a felt need, or there is a realization that there is a certain problem that needs to be addressed. And sometimes it can, like I said earlier, it can come from a political push. But if it does come from a bureaucracy, because in Sri Lanka, the way, I'm sure it's like that here too, you have the political arm of policymakers, and you have the bureaucracy, which are central government officials, more local, decentralized officials. And in the case of local level government officials, there is often a clearer sense of what needs to get done because they're working on the ground level. but with central officials there is more of a political push. And if I can talk about an example, CEPA was involved in helping IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, to work out their 3 or 4 year program in the next few years. And how we identified was certain regions that are poor that IFAD wanted to work in, but there was a certain political push to work in conflict-affected regions, because and all donors were being made to work in this region. So even though evidence was used to develop a series of thematic papers, a series of a rationale behind why IFAD should be working in certain areas that were outside the conflict zone, the process came to a stall because there was a political push to work in conflict-affected areas.
So would you say that research was used to set the agenda or to set the direction of the initial policy, but once it came to the implementation, once it came to the allocation of resources, other factors come to play?
It's still in the process of being decided, but even though research was used to show that these areas are more affected, have been affected for long periods of time, just as areas in the conflict-affected regions have been, it still is, it's not enough. You know, it needs to be rationalized even further, and the decision, unfortunately, is usually made at the central level. So and that is where it's most political. So even though we did validate it at a local level with local government officials, that didn't seem to be enough. There's still a push to work in areas that are outside of the regions that we were recommending.
Nuning, how do these factors that contribute to the use of evidence relate to Indonesia? What would you say are if you want, the factors that facilitate the use of research?
The assistance of not only the research institutes, although sometimes, we have to admit that sometimes they are very defensive about it. But by and by, the local government people, officials, for example, beginning to be more open-minded. Even surprisingly, which really happened 10 years ago, for example, they are beginning to invite the advocacy NGOs to provide them with a kind of partnership. So these advocacy NGOs will work with them. It was like providing them with it could be trainings for the officers.
For the government.
For the government officers. Okay? And also research institutes, of course. It's like we provide them with capacity building trainings.
And may I ask, are they, talking about decentralization at the regional level, are there many regional research institutes or local universities that have the capacity to do research for the regional government or the local government?
Some local university, especially in the area as like center of excellence, they would be able to provide enough. But of course, they also rely on some good research institutes from the central government to help them out.
Norma, can I ask you to take that idea of the decentralization process and to the Peruvian context, where there has been a big decentralization, where money has poured into the regions and the capacity to spend it isn't there? What is the role that evidence or research and research organizations are playing in this process, if any?
Well, it really depends on the area or the stage of the policy process in which we are located. In general, what I could say about Peru, and I think I can fairly generalize this for many Latin American countries, the role of evidence tends to be stronger at the agenda setting level, in which, of course, researchers have competitors, as for example the media, right? But that tends to be what I would say the strongest area for research institutions, think tanks, and alike, right? And A very different situation you find at the level of monitoring and evaluation, where the use of evidence tends to be stronger. For many reasons, one of them is, for example, there is not a strong culture of monitoring and evaluation. On the other side, there is no much supply of information on that side. But, I mean, given that, that as an overview, and going to Enrique's question on the decentralization process, I would say that the role of evidence in general has been rather weak, because it's just like to let you know that decentralization is a major political reform of the Peruvian state that began in early 2000, in the early 2000, I mean, to be exactly, that it began in 2001. And since then, we have invested a significant amount of resources in making decentralization happen, at least in legal terms. Problem is that this transfer of powers to the regions have not been complemented with a medium-term perspective in terms of policies that should be implemented to, for example, help local governments to make a good use or a better use or an efficient use of those resources. So this is a type of situation that, I mean, there is no one to blame, but it's rather, I guess, as a consequence of how our general political system works. It's a system that evidence does plays a role, but is very focused on a particular stage of the policy process.
Let me get you back to then the original question, the factors that affect the use of evidence in policy, or positively or negatively.
Well, I think I will focus on the negative factors. Just to begin with that, I think, I mean, if we analyze the supply side, I think for the Peruvian case, there's a lot to say about think tanks or research centers. I mean, I come from an institution that is a second floor organization, and we gather 46 universities and research centers in Peru. And even though, I mean, we have been promoting research-based evidence for more than 20 years, I mean, we have deeply realized that there's much to be done on the side of research centers to understand that they have a political role, and you have to understand and recognize that political role if you want to influence on policy. If you don't recognize that, it's very difficult, for example, to further engage in a process of influence that goes beyond publishing a paper or goes beyond giving, some general recommendations. So I guess, from my point of view, that is a major issue and could be sometimes an impeding factor. Because, for example, and I've seen many cases on this situation, some institutions will resist to further engage in a policy influence process because, for example, they don't want to compromise their independence, they don't want to compromise the neutrality, which are, of course, very reasonable arguments. But I think we need to find creative ways to kind of go beyond that type of situations and get a more proactive action. On the side of the demand, I would say that in general, it is very important to understand the dynamics of the demand of information from the side of the state. And for the case of the Peruvian state, and the situation is not very different in other Latin American countries, the demand of knowledge tends to be short-term, tends to be characterized by a huge presence of consultancies, that usually don't go beyond 6 months, 4 months, is very influenced by, I would say, situations that respond to demands that are not necessarily linked to policy planning in the medium term. So it's very, in a way, disorganized, if you want to call it that way. And I'm not saying this as a way of give that as the only explanation, because it is not. But my argument is that we need, on that side, understand the dynamics behind that demand to see how, as research centers, we can better respond to them. So that would be for the factors that impede policy.
Charles, let me ask you if you two questions. But the first one, if you well, from what you've heard, how different does this sound to the different countries that you work with, the different researchers you work with, would you say that this is very different from what might be happening in Kenya, for example? Or can you see some similarities?
Well, there are quite a number of similarities from the African Economic Research Consortium perspective, because we do a lot of research in sub-Saharan Africa. And all the researches that we do, almost 90% are basically policy-based, because these products, the research papers and any other products that AERC produces is supposed to inform policy. We even go as far as distilling reader-friendly, shorter versions of some of the research that we do. And these are called either they could be policy briefs or executive summaries. Because what we have realized that most policy makers who are supposed to use these products don't actually go to get the research and read them to help them make policy. In most cases, they would delegate to other people to read and then just give them a brief of what that research paper says. So if you can distill a policy brief from some of these research papers, we find it to be quite relevant, and it works with most of the policy makers. Although the biggest problem is that some of this work is not used, just like the panelists here have alluded to. Most policymakers actually based their policies on ideology or belief or what they think would work best. And in most cases, it's basically a shortcut. Instead of using what has been researched and it is based on research, they would basically just think of what can work in the short term and just use that.
Very good. And the other question I had to do with the way your AERC grantees and researchers, how are they trying to communicate or to make their research more available, more easily available to policymakers? Because many of them, we met some in a recent event, and many of them are actually policymakers themselves, right? They've been in the government, or they're in government as well and just doing some research. But how do they try to communicate this work a lot better?
I think the advantage that AERC has to date is that quite a number of network members are already in policy making positions. Like for instance, if we could give examples, the governor of the Central Bank of Tanzania, was actually the former executive director of AERC. The governor bank of Kenya was an employee, was the training director at AERC, as well as the deputy governor of the Bank of Uganda now. So you can see that in East Africa already we have people who are network members who are in policy making positions, and all of them have produced a research paper in one point of their lives or another. So they know why those research papers or any other research products are important. So it is with this that we are taking advantage, so that whenever we produce any material, whenever we produce any output from AERC, we make sure that it reaches their desks, and therefore they can take it up, whatever has been proposed, whatever policies that have been proposed in those research papers, they can take them up at policy level. So for AERC is for the people who have gone through the network and are members of the network. For AERC it is a bit easy, but still it is not very easy, because AERC works in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, and these are just 3 countries that I've counted. We have also network members in various countries, but they may not be in positions where these others are. So it obliges us to keep pushing, so that whoever are doing research in those countries can make sure that these researches reach the policymakers where the decisions in the countries are made.
I think that's very interesting. We have been doing some research on the relationship between political parties and think tanks in Latin America. We found many examples of or networks or groups of people who work on both sides of the research policy interface, if you want. So researchers were also appointed to the government, who are heads of the central banks, or who are vice ministers, or who come and go and keep an office in the university or at the think tank. And in that process, they share and they facilitate the flow of research-based evidence, which would be impossible in many cases because there are very complex issues, very difficult issues to just communicate quite quickly. I wonder if from Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and Peru, there are some examples of those communities where researchers and policymakers coexist, where they collaborate, where they work together, and which might facilitate that the flow of information.
Well, in the case of Sri Lanka, I think it does happen like that. But the way the research community is, it's not a homogeneous group.
Right.
So you do have researchers who are from academia, and academia means universities that are state-run, because all universities, education is free in Sri Lanka up to tertiary education, and most universities are run by the state. So these groups are, the researchers as a group is very heterogeneous, and that also, and because how they are defined gives them credibility. So if you are coming from a state-supported organization that does its own research, that has its own advocacy, which does support the state's message in a way, then you are seen as credible. But if you are a private organization, you have to work much harder to convince people that your research is credible, your evidence is rigorous, your research is sound. So I think, at least in the case of Sri Lanka, there is a difference. And I take the point that you made about having alliances and building alliances, and I think that's important. But it happens a little bit differently, I think.
Right. That's very interesting. What about Indonesia? Is that separation similar, or are there opportunities for groups to come together to form one community?
Yes, just lately, the kind of opportunity has come along. For example, academicians, meaning they're also researchers, have become parliament members, and they are more receptive. Maybe they don't do their own research now, but they have their friends, and their friends are willing, and also of course, his former institute and alma mater, or whoever within the certain networks that he belongs to, would like to provide him with policy inputs. And being a researcher himself or herself, they are more receptive to inputs from outside. And even they are also very open-minded about receiving inputs from the NGOs. Well, maybe it doesn't happen in many countries, but there were times when NGOs had a very bad reputation, and because of their frontal action, and they were not well received. But it's not that bad now. So, for example, the NGO people or the CSO people, think tank or university, would say that our friends in the government. That's when it works, because the things that you mentioned.
It's interesting. So you raised the issue of credibility. So it's not just about the research, but about where the research comes from. So and who is producing it. So it's the person and the organization they belong to, and that is different in Sri Lanka than it is in Indonesia because of the political context and structure. You mentioned. Sorry.
Just to add to that, I think also for Sri Lanka, it's about the issue that is being set.
Right.
I mean, given the political context right now, it's much more. It's difficult to influence policies on ethnicity, on social equality, on minority rights, and things like that. But it's easier to influence policies on development issues, about poverty. If you're coming at it from an economic angle, it's easier. It's not as easy, but there is a difference.
Is that because there is a consensus already around the development policy rather than the other one? Or is it more less politicized?
It's more politicized, the whole ethnic issue, given the conflict environment, post-conflict environment, it's much more politicized, and also because government right now is very nationalistic, they're pushing a very majority agenda, so bringing up issues and trying to influence human rights policy, issues related to ethnicity, just is not possible right now within the current environment. So I think it's really dependent on the issue that you're trying to influence.
Okay, so not just sector, but issues, specific issues that might be within a sector. There might be some issues that will have a different degree of political interest or media interest or polarization of the opinions.
So you either have to take a risk and influence it, risk of body harm sometimes, or you have to choose another way of trying to influence it, or you just don't.
Norma, what about in Peru? What about these coalitions or groups or networks?
Well, they are not very common, but there are significant efforts from different sectors of either civil society and also within universities and research centers. I will, for example, talk about what we have been doing at CIES. As I told you, we have 20 years of institutional life, and during this time, one of the main lessons we learned is that we should not expect people to knock our door. Even though our research is credible, is solid, our researchers are the most prominent in the country, that does not guarantee that there's going to be a demand, not even from policymakers, not even from journalists or other policy actors. So we have been, from the past 10 years, working on constructing regular policy platforms that could engage, could bring together policymakers and researchers from different fields. A good experience we have had is what we call the Presidential Academic Dialogues, which is an initiative that we have begun in 2008. The idea is very basic, and it's not our creation. I mean, we basically took the idea of what happened in Chile during Lagos government, and the idea was to bring together, like the best expertise, the best researchers on a particular topic requested by the president or by his closest advisors, to a meeting in which policy recommendations and key facts are shared with these top policymakers, but in a very closed environment. And we have done that 3 times already. There have been successful spaces for exchange, but I want to tell you something on how we have managed that space. I mean, we could have, for example, promote or that type of initiative as a policy influence one. We had all the right elements. But we decided not to do that, because if we would have framed that space in those terms, we would have broken the relationships of trust that took us so long to be built with these people. So we decided to frame it as a space of interaction and dialogue between the Peruvian academia and these top-level policymakers, and we forgot about the influence, at least at our rhetoric, right? And that has been, at the end of the day, a very good decision, because it helped us to even gain more trust from these policymakers, because, for example, as it was referred to one of them, they didn't feel that that we were trying to over-manipulate them. I mean, we can argue if that was is a proper way of framing it, but that's what they would feel about it. So after that experience, we learned to be more careful on how we frame these types of experiences. Some policymakers are more willing to participate in openly and broadly defined policy influence spaces. For our case, for example, that's easier to make in social policy, because for that type of issues, the profile of people you find them, I mean, it tends to be the type of subject that is or has to be more open to civil society or to some degree of consultation. But that is not the same situation in economics, for example. My institution is very strong in economics, especially in macroeconomic policy. So whenever we need to engage with these actors, we're not expecting them to attend any policy influence meeting, frame it as such. No, what we are probably more trying to do is to pursue close meetings where the relationships of trust between whoever is in power and the researchers always play a key role, regardless of the quality of research, the credits, and how sound it is.
Thank you, Norma. Charles, I'm going to skip you for a second, and I'm going to go back and ask more about the practical side of things, in terms of the roles, the more active roles that organizations like CEPA can play in trying to facilitate the use or the uptake of research in policy. And we know the main role that we all have is we are trying to use research-based evidence to promote certain policies, but what other roles does CEPA play in that context?
Okay, apart from just making or creating knowledge or information, doing research, I think as an organization, CEPA has a strong, or tries to have a strong dissemination, communications orientation, and that is because we realize the importance of needing to have information out there, needing to have it more available. And this is not something that just comes from internally and from within the organization. It's something that comes from the interactions we have with both state and non-state institutions. So I think one of the key roles that CEPA as a policy research organization can play is to build alliances around dissemination of information. And we try to do this by one of our key projects is through a resource portal, an online resource portal that we try to use to help information and to help get information out there. And this is also information that we try to target towards specific organizations and users that have identified the need for particular types of information. So, for example, at a decentralized state institute or a decentralized state officials, request often is about we don't have enough micro-level data to help us in deciding where to go and target our programs. So they know that there is a certain need within a certain area that they're working, but they can't justify why they would select a particular area. So having data at a micro-level is quite important. And we think that by creating a space to provide them that type of information, we're also building alliances with these organizations and with these decentralized officials who are quite receptive to the availability of data. And often when we go to them and say, look, we can give you this data either presented graphically in a certain way, they're like, okay, do you also have this? So it creates the space for them to voice the need of different types of information. The other thing I think that organizations like CEPA can do is to take its research to particular identified people who we think can influence. And one example here is that CEPA started working and monitoring the resettlement of a huge highway project in Sri Lanka, in the southern part of Sri Lanka. And we had to monitor whether the resettlement of families who were displaced from this development project was happening well, whether they were being compensated properly, whether they were, how they were feeling about the move and things like that. And we used a mixed methods approach to collect information about, that was the baseline, to monitor the progress. And initially working with the Road Development Authority was quite difficult for this project. They were not sure about the quality of the data, all because they didn't really know who CEPA was, they didn't really understand what our agenda was, what our role was as an independent monitoring organization. But now, it's been we started working with them in 2006, it's been 4 years, and now we're helping them do a self-reflection of the whole process of building this highway, so that they can take that learning and transfer it to building other roads in Sri Lanka, so that they won't make the same types of mistakes, or they actually factor the learning into their other work, which we think is a huge change in working with the state.
Let me just take a little gap in the conversation and bring somebody from the floor, from participants. Because Norma, you mentioned something about demand-led support and information, but in a slightly ad hoc way. So you get the president asking for something and there's a conversation. Azra, you've talked about something much more organized, much more structured, where there is a clear relationship between them. Emma Broadbent from GSDOC, who's sitting here, could you tell us a little bit more about the structure of GSDOC and how that works? Because this is an example from the UK about how they do that, so demand-led, if you want, research response. Maybe briefly, just a couple of words about
I think the first thing to understand, this isn't research, this isn't primary research. So the Governance and Social Development Resource Centre was set up by DFID in order to provide rapid response research to DFID advisors. So you have your governance advisors, you have your social development advisors, who are extremely busy, as we were talking about, and as Charles was saying, and like to increase. So what I do as a researcher, I'm given maybe a week, or basically 5 days, to work on a particular topic, gather literature, the relevant literature, and interview the relevant people, practitioners, academics, from both, global north, global south. Now, in terms of how that evidence is used, there's a clear bridging, if you like, of the gap between research and policy. And I think that begs the question of whether or not it's really about a gap that's being bridged, or just a navigation around a very large ocean, which is how I see more of my job. I don't see myself as a bridge. I see myself as a sort of a fish or a boat that's sort of pulling lots of advisors who aren't really sure about north, south, east, or west. But the thing to remember here is that this isn't primary research. This is secondary research. So I'm a if you like, I'm going to have to use bridge. I'm a way of academics getting to policymakers in the government.
Okay. And there's something so we can talk about. Thanks. Norma, you wanted to step in for a bit.
Yes, I wanted to give another example, because you mentioned, and this example I gave with the presidential academic dialogues, and yes, it's a very, if you want, direct way of responding to a demand. But we have also had another experience that I would share with you, because it's an experience that is more, if you would like to say, institutionalized, or at least less prone to political moves. And it's the constitution of what we call the consultative councils of our organization. As I told you, we are a network of 46 research centers and universities. I work in the executive office. And our work is basically, try to make closer policymakers or decision makers with our base. So in the perspective of doing that, we create this consultative space where we invited ministers but also other experts within the public sector to help us construct a research agenda that can supply additional information to the research agenda that is being built by our researchers following their priorities and methods. And it has been a very interesting experience. At the beginning, we were not very sure that this was going to work, but it has worked, because what we have made is a good incentive for our researchers to engage in work that responds to knowledge gaps that are not what the minister or Mr. Advisor X wants, but knowledge gaps that are related to the needs of the minister as an institution, the ministry as an institution. That's what I mean. So, just to give you a brief example of how it works, we basically see these people and they prioritize topics related to their existing plans and activities. And we consider those topics in our annual research competition. We give 5 awards from 20 to respond to the demands of these policymakers. And the results so far have been good, because on the side of our researchers, they don't feel they're being manipulated by politicians. because all of these topics are medium term, and on the side of these policymakers, they feel they are getting information that can actually be used to their planning processes.
Would you like to talk about maybe about an example about this, or maybe about the functions, the roles that organizations like SMERU play in Indonesia, besides the communication of research?
Well, apparently there are not too many research institutes in Indonesia. Not too many. But we are lucky that during the 10 years we have been able to build trust and integrity. So, in a way, like demand-led research also comes from the government. And that's when our research findings are really being used. And in addition to that, we, like what Norma said, interactive between our researchers with the policymakers sometimes can be very, very unofficial. So it's sometimes on daily basis, through telephones, mobiles, they want something to be prepared, but that is not going to change the independency of our research institute. And I think that is something that's also valued by the policymakers. But we also would like to be on the what? We don't want to be in their side, but therefore we also invite the other organizations. We share our findings to like hundreds of organizations doing advocacy. We don't do direct advocacy. But unlike what CEPA has done, we are not that well structured. So it's really up to them how to use it. But yes, there are also some organizations that we can ask together to do something together. For example, during one or two program evaluation or monitoring, or perhaps like facilitation for the local government, we ask some NGOs, advocacy NGOs to work with us. In that case, it's not just evidence-based, but it's also something on the advocacy side, which is not our strength.
Thanks. Charles, can I ask you, in reference to what Emma was just saying about the space in between research and policy and the need to navigate, one of the key roles that AERC plays is capacity building through master's programs. So you go into the higher education business in a sense, and you build capacity there. Ideally to bring those future policymakers closer to academic research, to reach its skills, so they can actually contribute much further. So it's about building a middle ground full of organizations and people rather than having two separate communities. Can you tell us about that aspect of AERC and the way in which you might see that as contributing to bringing research and policy closer together?
Yeah. When AERC was established, the main objective was to promote research, policy research. But we quickly realized that you cannot do research if you don't have capacity. So AERC developed a program for training. First, we began with the master's level, where those students who want to pursue economics at master's level will be granted some scholarship. So long as you qualify and you get admission in any African university, you can apply for a scholarship at the AERC. And AERC takes care of the student through to the 2 years of the master's program. At master's level, you can do good research. And the good thing again with AERC is that when you submit your proposal and you start doing research in the various thematic areas that we have quite a number of themes that any branch of economics, so long as we are doing research in any branch of economics, would fit in poverty, finance, trade, all those areas in economics. So in those areas also we have people who have done research, a lot of research, and are network members, and we consult them as resource persons to look at some of the proposals, some of the research reports that have been submitted to kind of peer review before we can publish the research papers, just to give the research papers credibility. So it is important to build capacity, because if you don't build capacity, you won't have people to do to come up with the good quality research that you can share with the policy makers. AERC also has a program for PhD. We call it a collaborative PhD program. So if you also qualify and you get admission in any African university, you can apply for a scholarship at AERC, and if you are successful, then AERC can take care of the full program. So that is how we help in building capacity, both at master's and at PhD level, so that the research that...
Any questions or comments from
Yeah, but related to capacity building, something that we have learned that is very important is to work with journalists. And over the past 8 years, we have been developing within different projects capacity building initiatives that come and support journalists in Peru, given radio, television, or printed media, to better use research when they produce news, when they do the work. And in order to do that, we, for example, deliver workshops in which they do practical work on a particular piece of research with the presence of the author. And this is very interesting because, on one hand, it helps journalists to better understand some topics, as for example, trade policy or macroeconomic policy, that, as you very well know, are specialist topics. But on the other hand, give them ways or techniques on how to, pick the proper data or the proper angle of the information in their news making. And this has been useful for the journalists we work with. We have a network of people we have been supporting for this period, but it has also been very useful for our researchers, that sometimes we're concerned about how the research will be presented on the media, and how that will, affect how sound it was, or how sound it was perceived by non-academic actors. So it was a win-win experience, and I think, should also be considered as a good practice for other organizations that are working on policy influence in a wider sense.
Let me open it up. Are there any questions, comments, similar experiences that you might want to share with? Yes, could you say your name, where you come from, and then...
Yeah, my name again is I come from Uganda, work with the Economic Policy Research Center as a senior research fellow. Thank you so much, finally, Chair. Personally, I have gained some insights on how the different institutions are working with university policy. Just two aspects. One, of course, I'm asking in the form of a question, but also a comment. The attachments, where you have, say, people working with the government, your policy makers, getting attached to research institutions sometimes as a way of, bringing the experience from the policy makers, of course, also getting the experience from research institutions. Of course, the EPRC that has been practiced, where we have had some research fellows going to work with the ministers as their advisors, and in a way influencing the process of policy making, and of course getting back the side. So I'm asking whether that has been practiced in your organizations and how effective it has been. Of course, in our case, it has been is working. The other one is the funding. I'm seeing it from the social funding. You know, if you have the government funding the institution, that can be you want to use the institution, you know, to do research and based on the findings influence policy. But I've also seen that where the government partners finance this institution, of course they go back to influence government policy the way, you know. So I see that happen in ERC Uganda, and I don't again whether of course, some of the things you talked about, maybe just one or two comments on capacity. I think it's critical because, you see, the institution doing research should have capacity, should be credible, and therefore should be trusted by policymakers. What is going to come out of it? Yes, it's really evidence-based findings. And of course, finally, it's the issue of setting the agenda. Just been mentioned. In our case, what we've done this year is we have gone out to pick the government overarching plan to pick out what is the government plan to get the accountable. What are the critical things? Then we pick out and then send back to the government, the policy. These are the things we want to start with. And of course, we get the comments back. So I think in that way, yes, we can influence, and of course we can be touched.
Thank you. So we'll ask for more questions, but just to rephrase, the experience on facilitating this flow of people from government to research and vice versa, funding, relationship between funding and the relationship of the grantee and the government, and who gives the money. Clearly, I think the question of capacity and quality is a key issue. Right? The quality of the research is non-negotiable when it comes to research-based evidence, or research-based influence. And then finally, to do with setting the agenda, engaging in that space. And I'll ask the panel members to choose maybe one that you want to focus on. Anybody else want to say something? Comments? We'll go to you, and then.
Thank you. I'm Rika Torpo from the European Union delegation here in Salaam. I actually would be very, very interested as a relative newcomer in the country to get a view from the Tanzanian colleagues here in the room with the same kind of an overview that the panelists have given, very interesting overviews of the situation in their country. Also, how the Tanzanian researchers see the situation in Tanzania. And I think there's a very interesting process ongoing at the moment on the whole review of the country long-term development strategy, 5-year poverty reduction strategy equivalent, and the drafting of a new one, which is due to enter into force from July. And I think it will be just very interesting, at least for me personally, if I may take opportunity of this situation to hear the perception of and the views of the Tanzanian colleagues on the status of evidence-based research and its influence on policy in Tanzania.
May I make sure that we answer that in the next session, where we will be talking about evidence and policy in Tanzania and Africa. If not in the session, during the conversation, we're not the best to answer that. But certainly, if it's not answered, I'll raise my hand and ask about that. Yes.
Hi. This was slightly following on from your mention of capacity building. It mainly directed at Charles. And I say this as a big AERC fan and a huge fan of the AERC model. You talk about what the AERC does in terms of tertiary education, in terms of capacity building. And I don't know if it might just be easier to talk about this as teaching. Teaching how to do research, teaching research methods. focus that on Africa because we're in Africa, and I'm sure there's completely different examples from Asia and Latin America, but I think there's I don't want to get too into syntax, but there's certainly a gain to be made by thinking about teaching and thereby supporting things like the AERC, which I think are absolutely critical to any sort of promotion of evidence. Less a question, more a statement.
But I'll let Charles come back to that. Anybody else before? Oh, yes.
Yes, it's Stephen Ford from the message. What I grabs out of your presentation here is very simple. Research as such, but you don't go into the specifics of what kind of research. And I have heard a lot about the coverage of one discipline of education, such as economics. Do you also do research in other disciplinary areas like law, politics, public policy? And again, those of us who have not been exposed to these kind of research things, we might want to know specifically what does the research look like and how do you present it to government or public policy makers in a specific country that you work on.
So different types of research and in these different sectors or issues, how to present the research, how to carry it out, how to present it.
What it looked like.
Okay.
And what disciplinary areas you discuss. Because what I'm hearing is a lot more of economics than anything else. Politics, law,
right,
public policy, diplomacy, and all these areas seem not to be covered.
Okay. Yes. Last one.
My name is Lynette. I work for AERC Kenya. I wanted to make a contribution to why research is not being used in the policy making process. And I have got two issues. One is our level of engagement. For how long as researchers or as experts in different issues do you engage in the same field? Given that maybe most research institutions are donor financed or they are project-based, we keep on moving from one project to another one. So when the government comes back to ask you on an issue you were engaging last year, you are no longer engaging on the same issue and you are not able to move together with the government on policy issues. Two is our failure as researchers to provide scenarios. Most of the time we provide policy recommendations which have no scenarios that are exhaustive. Because from a policymaker's perspective, they want to know who are the beneficiaries and who are the losers of the policy. So as institutions, we just give recommendations. You recommend for this, this, and this, but then you don't move the step forward to give the government or the policymakers the different scenarios. If you engage this way, or if you revise the policy this way, this kind of population will lose, this one will benefit. But at the end of it, as long as the people benefit are more than the ones who are losing, or in the short time, this group of population will lose out. But maybe after 5 years, as long as the government follows the same policy, this is how much they're going to pay. So those two make our contribution to evidence-based policy making.
That's very interesting. It's the business of research, right? The way it's funded, the way it's managed, the incentives mean that we move on, and don't get to do some of the things that Charles was talking about, the extra engagement, the communication, the follow-up, or the work that CEPA do in terms of working with different policy actors at different policy levels over a long period of time, maybe working with the media on a particular piece of work that you've done. You don't just present the report, but you then train the media. That has to be done by somebody, and if the researcher hasn't been given the opportunity to do that, if their capacity hasn't been built, for instance, to engage in that process, that may be quite difficult. Can I bring some of those questions back to the panel? Because of time, we won't probably get to answer all of them, but we have a session later on where we have a discussion. Can I start with Azra? Any other questions you might want to ask?
I'll respond to the last one about the last one and maybe one about using government funding. First, in relation to your point about offering donors as well as government, potentially if you're being funded by government, you have, and this is a problem that CEPA faces too. I mean, the policy engagements that we've been able to push forward, invest the kind of time that we want to invest in it, have been funded. Yeah, we haven't been able to do as much as we would like to on certain other issues, even though we do have the information, because, like you said, we're running against assignments, running against needing to finish up certain projects. But I think this whole engagement is also about donors and funders realizing that they need to invest time and money into this component of research, needing to use research for advocacy, needing to use research to influence, takes time, takes money, takes a huge effort that organizations sometimes cannot support. Research organizations can't support themselves as much as they may be able to support the research. Yeah, so it is quite a key thing in this type of discussion, and I'm glad you brought it up. In relation to funding coming from the government and your credibility getting colored as a result, I think our experience has been that we have worked with government, but we haven't worked with the political arm of government. We work with institutions that are set up within the state. We work with local government authorities who are civil servants. So I think that is quite key in helping us establish a certain level of independence, being a research organization that is in the private sector. And also the way funding is arranged is that you partner with these organizations. You may not necessarily get paid by these organizations. So you are paid by the ADB, for instance, who's funding a project, but you have to partner with a certain organization within the state, who then you can use to influence.
I think that's also happening in my country.
Right.
We don't. If you use the word attachment, we are not really attached, but we are attached. And it's a bit possible. But like what happened in CEPA, the government never found research done by our institute, and basically because we are independent, and also for other research institutes, they don't fund. So they can't claim that it's their own. But during the meeting with the policymakers, for example, with national board, with certain ministry, for example, there are always funding agencies there, and they would fund us. And with that, through that kind of arrangement, the evidence that we can bring for them is something that we need. And yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned about the trust, capacity, and quality, and then also, but I would like to mention something about setting the agenda. Well, unlike what has been done by Norma and her organization, it's so hard to set the agenda, research agenda for our research institute. Although we have medium-term or long-term research plan, but they're always coming in, bombarding us, demands on something which is something of recent issues, always something new. So, and we don't have that much resources to do what we really would like to do as a research institute. So sometimes we have to fight between saying yes or saying no. And mind you, we still have to watch out whether we are sustainable or not. So it's threading upon a very trying to find constant balance. It's not an easy undertaking in my country. As to you're wondering about whether what kind of research that we do. Yes, we do social protection research, we do poverty research, we do public services research on education, on health, but we don't do political research because many of those issues have been captured by the research institutes which are hired by the political parties, and of course
Very quickly, Norma.
I think in terms of discipline, what everyone asked, AERC is purely economics. We don't do research. Although there are some linkages with other disciplines, like we are going into climate change, and there's interdisciplinary linkages. But AERC is purely economic research. We don't do research in any other disciplines. In terms of funding and influence, although AERC gets funding from some governments in Africa and also outside Africa, the structure that we have is in such a way that the government cannot influence what AERC does in terms of who sets the research agenda. Because we have a structure where we have a program committee that actually decides on what programs AERC can get into. So the funders just put money in a pool, and then they don't have any influence in terms of who sets the agenda. The other question was on capacity building. And I have a colleague from AERC as well who is in charge of research. But what I know is that even in economics, one of the areas that are taught both masters and PhD level is research methods. So it is a compulsory subject, such that you cannot do your PhD or you cannot do your masters if you have not done that unit. But I have a colleague here who is also from the research department and can tell us more.
Do you want to tell us more? Has Charles put you in a very difficult position?
Maybe I cannot answer that in one sentence, but just to say that there are several programs, even within the research. We have the thematic research, which actually started as a training before also research. Hands-on research. Then we have for collaborative research, which is much more for senior researchers who have maybe gone through the thematic research and mainly focus on policy research. So they already have the techniques, and therefore it is much more with policy relevant research.
I was questioning that actually. I would say that that's the ideal. I don't think that happens, and I think that a lot of evidence is being produced by people who don't have sound research methods and haven't been taught. So when we talk about capacity building of research institutes or NGOs or anywhere, we're not talking about capacity building, we're just saying, actually let's teach them. And maybe we should take like proper teaching programs, not workshops, teaching.
Can I we have a session later in the day, and now we're going to be I'm already over the time, but he is allocated. Norma, final words.
Yeah, well, kind of like following on your question. We do economic and social research, but for example, in the social area, we work on economics, labor, and health. But it is interesting that despite that, that broad agenda, we usually get demanded on macroeconomics and social protection. That's our usual and regular demand. But I remember your question about how does research look like. In our case, when we promote our research outside the academic sphere, well, we basically disseminate a set of policy recommendations that arise from specific papers. However, we have been facing a challenge on that, which is how to raise the quality of those recommendations. Because I mean, sometimes it has happened to us that the research, like the full paper, can be really good, but the recommendations are rather too vague, or are too general, or are full of good intentions, but not concrete actions, or concrete steps on how to follow. So it's a challenge that is being, taken within my institution, and we have realized that probably it's time to switch from policy recommendations broadly defined to concrete policy proposals if we want to increase our chances of having some influence.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry for going over time. I hope this was the start of the conversation, and you will now hear about these issues in Tanzania and Africa, and hopefully that leads to further discussion.